the suicidal action is peacemaking. You've got to recover the situation, because your job as the police is to maintain order, because part of the role of the state is to protect its citizens. The police, if we look at Max Weber's work, the police are those who are authorized by the state to use violence to keep peace. And consequently, the police have that responsibility, which is clearly overseen by a variety of bodies, but basically they can use up to lethal force to stop things from deteriorating to the point where communities fracture and things become really unacceptable. So peace building, peacekeeping and peacemaking were the overlays of the policing activity, and within each of those were quite an in-depth piece of research on what those different titles meant in terms of behavioral study.
Fascinating. So, I mean, you did say before that a number of your colleagues, let's say, in policing, and I'm not sure if this was at leadership level or throughout the ranks, either resisted this or weren't terribly interested because they liked to be involved in the action. And I remember in England, you used to give speeches on what happens when nothing happens. So how do you get, first of all, I suppose, policing colleagues on board with a model like this, especially when it's invisible to people in the public and maybe even in the government that don't really see what's going on in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I mean, really, you've hit the nail on the head. Let's face it, if you were to look at any school curriculum, there are two major things that are missing. One is financial awareness, so training young people how to manage their finances effectively. And the second, and I would argue probably as important, if not more important, is how do you manage conflict? How do you deal with situations where you don't just lose your temper and strike out? And, I've used this expression before. There's an awful lot of children wandering around in adult bodies, meaning there's a lot of people who still have their childlike behaviors and their childlike attitudes into their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s because nobody's taken time out, or they've not taken time out to actually learn how to manage conflicts that they find themselves in. So what my philosophy is based on is the fact that if we actually understand that these conflicts have an origin and that they have a path from relative normality to abnormality, and that if we can recognize the changes of behavior on that path, we can then, if we are skilled enough and trained well enough, intervene appropriately, then the chances are that we can stop things from getting worse. So the presentation that you just referred to, what happens when nothing happens, I had a national conference in England where I got 6 police commanders from around the country who I knew were really skilled commanders in very difficult circumstances. And basically, I got them to tell the story of how they stopped things from happening. And it was based on a huge amount of research on their part, understanding the history, understanding culture, understanding where the pinch points and the tensions were, and then intervening appropriately, often with personal risk to themselves, to ensure that we didn't end up with manifestations like you've seen in Washington, D.C. and other places where people just, they just get violent on the streets. And after that conference, about half of the attendees sort of got it, but they didn't quite get it. Of the remainder, the other half, 25% were not interested at all because all they wanted to do was the street fighting. And the other 25% really were quite confused as to what it was that we were trying to talk about. But I go back to the basic principles, what Robert Peel established in 1829 in the United Kingdom when he established the Metropolitan Police. And he said that the whole purpose of the police is to keep the peace. And if there's crimes committed, then they've got to intervene and stop the crimes from being committed, arrest people if that's necessary. But fundamentally, their role is to keep the peace. And in keeping the peace, that allows for society to get on with its lives. It allows people to put their children on a bus to take them to school without worrying, is my child going to arrive safely? And a whole range of things which have their origins in understanding how conflicts and how these tensions develop. And that if, in the case of the police, if they ignore the escalation path, then they inevitably end up with just what happens at the end, which is, rioting on the streets, people shooting one another and whatever, and the police have to intervene with their batons and their gas and whatever. And my view is, if the police generally can understand the escalation path, then they can intervene more effectively earlier in the stage and stop these things from happening in the first place.
Mm. Yeah, I know you often talk about life really being lived in the gray areas, and so don't look for black and white solutions. But people seem to like black and white solutions. It's either tit for tat, right or wrong. He said, she said, I'm right, you're wrong, that kind of thing. I suppose I'm curious, number one, about the role of the media, particularly in the early perception stages, but I suppose in whether you found in your experience the media has inflamed conflict by taking sides in a black and white way more than they've ameliorated the situation.
I'm not so sure that the media takes sides, but certainly what it does do is to sensationalize circumstances which often don't require that. And one has to ask the question, what's the motivation? And, very quickly one comes to the conclusion that in a competitive commercial market for 24-hour news, whoever can sensationalize news the better and attract more viewers or listeners, then that's a mark of success. It's one of a number of components of this whole business of conflict. But I think the point you're making, or the reference you're making about grey areas, where when I joined the police in 1970, I was told by one of my instructors, you join the police to deal with the grey areas of society, things that people can't work out for themselves. So don't start looking for black and white answers. And my view then was, if we don't understand how conflict works, we are consigned to constantly react to disorder, rioting, damage, looting, and that sort of thing, without ever determining what the origins were and what we could have done better.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, in the couple minutes we have left, do you see this model translating in a more general sense to the public, for communities, for organizations, even families, perhaps?
Absolutely. I mean, I've painted a very simple two-dimensional picture. It's obviously more complex than that. Yeah. But if people understand why conflicts occur and why their emotions get involved very, very quickly, then at least I'm a great believer in, the earlier we can get at people, the better it is. But if we can demonstrate to young children in schools that there are other ways than just lashing out through emotion, then we've got the opportunity to explain why things occur in the way they do. And then as a result of that explanation and understanding, being able to intervene more effectively so that we don't end up with, the sorts of manifestations we've had over the last few weeks in the United States, where people turn up with guns and attack people simply because of a difference of political opinion.
Yeah, pretty crazy, isn't it? So Douglas Brand, we need to wrap it up here. If people want to contact you to ask questions or make comment, do you have a way you'd like them to reach you?
Yeah, douglasbrandspeaking.com is the website, and a lot of what I talk about in addressing organizations and that sort of thing, both has the origins of the theoretical stuff I've just been explaining briefly, but also my practical experience in Iraq and Darfur and Afghanistan, West Bank of Palestine, and those sorts of places. Fantastic.
Wonderful. What a rich history, and we're so grateful you share them with us here. So thank you very much. Appreciate you being here. And I want to thank our listeners as well for being with us and showing relief on the SOBradionetwork.com and the Living Legacy Leadership Show. And I want to send you on to GameChangerThinking.com as well, just to check out what's going on over there. So with that in mind, we'll finish up reminding you that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Bye-bye now.